I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. It's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
President Biden addressed the nation last night for the first time since ending his presidential campaign. He said he deserves a second term based on his record, but he's going to pass the torch for the good of his party and the country. The Hill White House correspondent Alex Gangitano joins us to discuss. Alex, there wasn't any acknowledgement in the remarks of why so many Democrats wanted him off the ticket. What did you make of the speech?
Yeah, so this speech was definitely, I think, an emotional moment for the president. It was a time for him to do his first appearance, first speech since he stepped off the ticket and decided to drop his reelection bid. He's sitting in the Oval Office. Definitely a historical moment, surrounded by family members who are behind on the other side of the cameras and his closest advisors. And one of the things he made sure to point out, you showed the clip that he said, you know, it's sometimes younger voices are necessary. He also said that in the past few weeks, it's become clear that he had to do something in order to unite the Democratic Party. He did acknowledge, by alluding to that there were Democrats who took issue with him staying on the ticket. And of course, we saw calls, some 30 Democrats calling for him to step down. He also talked a lot about his fight for democracy, which has been an ongoing theme of his administration and during when he was running for re-election, that he wants to preserve democracy. And he really put it in the hands of the American people without mentioning former President Trump, but basically that the decision in November comes down to preserving the republic, preserving democracy. And he, warned everybody about the threats of not doing so. So a lot of takeaways from this speech, but it was definitely a historical moment of him actually addressing, in some sense, this really tough decision to end his, 50 years long political career.
The Kamala Harris for President campaign is kicking into full gear. The campaign launched its first video ad with the theme of freedom, set to a song titled Freedom by Beyonce. Are we starting to get an idea of what this campaign is going to look like?
Yeah, I think we are. The vice president already has hit up the campaign trail, speaking in Indiana yesterday, in Texas today. And we've been getting, snippets about what her speeches will look like down the line. And a lot of it is freedom. She has been the leading voice out of the Biden administration on reproductive rights and freedom over deciding what you can or can't do with a woman's body. That's been something that's been huge for her. And then she's also talked about other freedoms, the freedom to vote, the freedom to something she brought up today in Texas, the freedom to learn about American history. She's alluding to the calls for book bans in some Republican states. So the freedom to be protected from gun violence was another issue, is to go to school and not, live in fear of gun violence. That she brought that up in her speech today. So I think that will be an ongoing theme for her. It's something that, of course, the president talked about on the campaign trail, but I think that she's putting her own spin on a lot of these values that are very much what he was running for as well and talking about in his messaging, but she's putting her own voice behind it.
There's a lot of speculation over who Harris could pick as her vice president. Folks in Arizona, including Democratic Senate candidate Ruben Gallego, think Senator Mark Kelly could give the Harris campaign a jolt. What are seen as the pros and cons of Senator Kelly?
Yeah, Senator Kelly definitely comes with a lot of pros. First of all, he's a former astronaut, which is historically very popular with Americans. He also is married to former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who's a gun violence survivor. There was an assassination attempt against her at a Arizona grocery store in 2011. She survived, and now she's a gun violence prevention advocate. Her and Senator Kelly are behind the movement Giffords that advocates for gun violence prevention. So that's a huge platform I just mentioned that Harris is running on. He brings that to the table. He also is I think I'd put this in the pro and con section. He's pretty tough on the border. I think the border is something that she's struggled to turn around her messaging on it after she was kind of given the task to look at the root causes of migration at the U.S. southern border. And that was an extremely difficult task that people thought she had a really rough start on. And I think Republicans are ready to use that against her on the campaign trail. So having a Democrat who's much more moderate on the border and really tough on the border, I think could be useful to her, but it also could be a con in the sense that it, puts this in the forefront with her work on the border. Also, another thing with him that is both a pro and con is that he's from the state of Arizona. That's a really critical swing state for Democrats, but it also is a state that currently has a Democratic governor that would be able to appoint a Democrat to replace him if he does, win on a future ticket. But down the line, a couple of years from now, that could end up being a flip towards Republicans. And I don't think Democrats would be thrilled to lose that seat.
Another possible VP pick is Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky. He's been sort of playing attack dog, especially when it comes to Republican vice presidential pick J.D. Vance. Are these attacks basically auditions for the job of vice presidential candidate?
Yeah, it sure sounds like it. The two of them have been going head to head, and it's been fascinating to look at, considering, Andy Beshear right away was a contender, I think, for the vice presidential pick, just because he's definitely a rising star in the Democratic Party, considering he runs the state of Kentucky, which is a ruby red state, and he is a popular governor. I think Democrats are have pointed to his ability to run a red state as a shining point for them. Now he's been taking on J.D. Vance between TV appearances and interviews. Of course, the bordering states of Kentucky and Ohio, and the rural communities between both of them are something that J.D. Vance is definitely leaning on as he's running for vice president, and Andy Beshear is bringing up often as questioning his agenda and what he sees as the future of the party. He also, this point of upbringing that they've brought up, J.D. Vance has used against him, that Beshear's father was the governor of Kentucky previously, that he didn't have, the same upbringings that Vance so famously has. So the two of them, fighting it out in public does seem like an interview for vice president, so to speak. But I do think Beshear comes with a lot of benefits to the ticket as well. And one of them is just knowing this part of America that, Vance knows as well, and that Democrats have been struggling to get those voters to resonate with them.
One of the issues that Biden was facing when he was a candidate is a softening of support among some progressive voters over his handling of the war in Gaza. The question is, can Harris chart a path forward that unites the Democratic Party and brings in the so-called uncommitted delegates to the convention?
Yeah, this is a big question, especially now as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington meeting with both Biden and Harris separately after he spoke to Congress yesterday. There is some daylight between what Biden thinks of the war in the Middle East and what Harris thinks. Harris, I will say, has been a staunch supporter of the president and his decisions to send arms and support to Israel. She also has stressed that Israel has the right to defend itself, and that the October 7th attacks were horrific terrorist attacks. This is all part of how she feels about it, which is exactly the same as Biden. But she has given more forceful speeches, and her rhetoric about it has been different. That the war, there has to be a ceasefire. There's been too many civilian casualties. And I think we'll see her lean more into that because, as you mentioned, there's this uncommitted movement during the Democratic primary. We saw people that were pro-Palestinian or just, anti-Israel support from the U.S. or whatever else who were protesting Biden with their vote and voting uncommitted instead, or writing in something like Gaza. Those people have to be, according to Democrats, brought back into the fold, so to speak. And I think Harris, this presents an opportunity for her to be able to show that maybe she is different from Biden on this issue. I talked to people from the Abandoned Biden movement just the other day since she's become the top of the ticket. And they've said, we actually are willing to sit down and meet with her. This is the movement that was behind a lot of these uncommitted votes. They're giving her an opening to explain her stance on this and explain how she might be different than Biden on it. And that's just a step in the right direction that they're even willing to have a conversation, because that was not something that they were willing to do with Biden.
Republican messaging on Kamala Harris has been a bit scattershot. Some have labeled her a DEI hire, basically saying she only got the VP job because she's a black woman. Now, that line of attack has been criticized by some Republicans, including House Speaker Mike Johnson. Where do Republicans go from here when it comes to defining Harris?
Yeah, Johnson definitely warned them against leaning into sexism and racism and whatever else when talking about Harris, that's dangerous territory that the American people do not want to see. So I do think if they can lean away from that and focus on other, policy issues. I mentioned the border earlier. I think that's where we're going to see Republicans really head, is her work on the border or not enough work on the border. The Biden administration has come out with an executive order that has slowed down the influx of migrants at the border, but a lot of Republicans think that was too little, too late, that he should have stepped up sooner and done something on the border. And I think they're going to equate Harris to all of those issues that this administration has had with immigration. And she also is already part of that issue, considering one of the first tasks she was given was to look at the root causes of migration. And so that's a huge one. I also think they'll just tie other issues that they were already tying Biden to, and say that she's just another part of his administration. These are all her issues as well. Of course, the economy is something that Republicans are really strongly running on. And I think they'll just use her as an example of, if you want 4 more years of the Biden economy, this is who you'll get. And then at the same time, I do think that they're going to try to use it against her that Biden ended up dropping out, that Biden did face questions about his age and mental stamina, and use it against her as a way to say, you should have spoken up, or how much did you know and you weren't honest with the American people.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today in Washington. It comes a day after the Prime Minister spoke to a joint session of Congress where he defended his country's war in Gaza. The appearance sparked protests near the Capitol, where American flags were burned and public spaces were vandalized with pro-Hamas graffiti. Now, Harris is out today with a strongly worded statement denouncing the excesses of the protests. What's she saying? Yeah,
she has strongly denounced this protest. Said, that it's unacceptable for this kind of behavior among Americans to be taking down the American flag, the images of burning the flag that we saw at Union Station. So this is, another area that I think that she will be judged by. There was a need for her to say something. And of course, this is activity that the Biden-Harris administration will define as anti-American. At the same time, these protesters, I think, were also hoping that she would bring or side more with them in, their anger towards Israel. So she's balancing all of that. But, her coming out with this statement definitely aligns with what we've seen from Biden, that, protests are peaceful. If they're peaceful, they're acceptable. But if they turn into, violent and anti-American, then, they're not acceptable. So she's aligning with him there. I think we're also going to see, as her and Biden are meeting with Netanyahu, some other protests come out. And this is definitely a challenge for her, just, days after she said she'd be running for president, to be dealing with how to respond to these kinds of issues.
Over in Congress, the House is planning to start its August recess after failing to pass annual government funding bills. But when Speaker Mike Johnson took the gavel, he vowed that a recess would not begin without passing all 12 bills. The Speaker threw out side deals reached between President Biden and former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. What are Republicans saying about this, and What hopes do they have of negotiating with Democrats before the end of the year?
Yeah, so Congress headed out for research, the House headed out. And so at this point, no one is expecting the annual funding process to be completed by September 30th. Of course, like you mentioned, that's a different outcome than Speaker Johnson said that he wanted when he took over the speakership. We are hearing that hardline conservatives are advocating for a stopgap measure, basically the continuing resolution that would prevent funding from lapsing into March of next year. I think they're not happy with the decision to go on recess instead of passing something, and they're trying to avoid a December government funding deadline that helps, tee up these spending fights that any sort of fight like this that Republicans are stopping negotiations or even leading towards a government shutdown. Those are all negatives. And, ahead of the November election, if it looks like things are moving in that direction, that's not great for Republicans on the campaign trail. So I think we're seeing some inter-party, disagreements over how to move forward on this, but we won't know until they're back from recess where they go from here.
Donald Trump is standing firm on his pick of J.D. Vance to be his running mate even after the shakeup at the top of the Democratic ticket. There's been some reporting inside the Republican Party that there's regret over the Vance pick in light of that new reality. Tell me about that, and what's Trump saying now?
Yeah, so we have seen Trump come out and say, I still think Vance was a good choice. I don't think he's going to admit otherwise at this point. He either has a decision to double down or to ask him to move aside. And it seems like at this point, he's going to double down on this decision. The decision with Vance was a decision to lean into his base. Vance helps, the MAGA movement. He's seen as kind of the heir to the MAGA movement as a 39-year-old senator who is aligned with Trump now, former Trump critic, I should point out, but now aligned with him. He also, brings, we were talking about his background versus Andy Brashear, he brings this working class, rural American town, towns that feel like they were left behind by politicians in Washington, D.C. These are all, pillars of the MAGA movement. And he brings that, embodies that with his own background. So I think Trump feels strongly that he can bring a lot to the table, but also that he rallies the base and he gets, the people that are true Trump supporters excited. And, he wasn't a decision to try to expand the base or to try to get moderates pulled into the fold. And so I think what he's doing for Trump is exactly what the plan always was. But yeah, at this point, I think we're going to see Trump just doubling down on his decision and then move forward. And we'll see, when they campaign in places where Vance is well received, I think we will see less, rumors about calls for if Trump's going to ask him to step off the ticket.
Now, if Trump is reelected, reports are that he'll look to the U.S. Senate to fill key government positions. Some of Trump's appointees from his first administration later became some of the most vocal critics. Is he looking at senators this time around that he thinks will be more loyal?
I think that's right. A lot of the U.S. Senate has gotten in line behind Trump, whether it took 2016 to 2020 to do so or more recently, like a J.D. Vance. They have fallen in line or largely fallen in line. And I think that those are the people that Trump feels, comfortable with, that they have his back. And, why not choose them for a cabinet? Because like you said, in the last cabinet, there were people that ended up being, anti-Trump and have spoken out against him since they've left office, even, quit during the January 6 rallies, weeks before they would have been out of office anyway, but, quit in protest. These are all things that he's trying to avoid in the next administration and get these loyalists behind him. And I think the Senate and Senate Republicans are a good example of people that have had time to adapt to Trump's rhetoric, thinking. And if they still have his back now, Trump probably assumes they're gonna have his back during a 4-year presidency.
All right, that's all I got. Alex Gangitano, thanks so much for coming on. New polling shows a tightening presidential race since Joe Biden stepped down and Vice President Kamala Harris assumed the role of presumptive Democratic nominee. Former President Trump still leads nationally and in most swing states, but Harris is doing better than Biden was before he quit the race. Joining us to discuss is Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, you guys looked at 5 swing states. What should we know about how voters are digesting the big shakeup at the top of the Democratic ticket?
We did. And frankly, we were a little shocked with the results. The race is on. It's more competitive than it was just a week ago. We see Vice President Harris up in all states by at least 3 points compared to where Biden was earlier this month. And I think that what we're seeing is some of these Democratic-leaning voters coming back into the fold for Harris. We see her winning younger voters overall across the states, 53% among 18 to 29, 46% among 30 to 39. And then minority voters, especially African-American voters, we see her winning 79% across all the states. And then when we get a little bit further down and look at the expanded ballot, we see that there's lower support for Kennedy. And we see, I think, these Democratic-leaning voters starting to, quote unquote, come home to Harris. So the dynamics of this race have changed significantly in just a week. I think that Vice President Harris is in a much better standing than President Biden was last week. And so, again, this is very competitive. It varies by state, but we can see both in the Rust Belt as well as, at least in Georgia, maybe not all of the Sun Belt, but at least in Georgia here, we see really competitive races.
Let's talk about Wisconsin. It's one of the key states in the Democratic blue wall that secured the presidency for Joe Biden in 2020. Your poll found a tie in Wisconsin, 47 to 47. That's a 4-point improvement for Harris compared to where Biden was last month. What accounts for that change?
Yeah, it's a significant shift. I think that what we're seeing are, first of all, independents who Harris is now winning. We see, again, some of these younger voters. She's winning those as well. And then we also see that she's winning minority voters, especially African-American voters, by a 7-1 margin. She's also winning a majority of women, 54%. So again, we're seeing her rebuild that Democratic coalition that we saw slipping away from the Biden campaign. It's a similar story in Georgia. She gained about 4 points. And that, again, was attributable to some of these younger voters and African-American voters in particular supporting Harris at much higher levels than we've seen earlier in this race.
Arizona is an interesting state. Biden won it in 2020. The Democratic Senate candidate is consistently leading the Republican, but Biden had been down. Harris is down 5 points in your poll. What do you think is the state of play in Arizona?
Yeah, Arizona is a little bit more of an outlier among these 5 states. Yes, Harris has gained compared to where Biden was, but it is looking more difficult for Harris. She's not winning Hispanic voters by the margin that she likely needs to in order to pull ahead of President Trump here. And Trump wins among all voters over the age of 30 right now. That's a really difficult place to be if you're reliant upon strictly these 18 to 29-year-olds who we're not sure about turnout and who are more undecided than a lot of these other older voters who might be paying a little bit more attention. So there's still a ways to go. Arizona is not off the table, but it's a much heavier lift for the Harris campaign the way we see it right now in some of this underlying data.
Something I found interesting in your poll is the gender divide. Across the 5 swing states, Trump is leading among men by more than 13 points. Meanwhile, Harris's lead among women is less than 8 points. It would seem to me that whether or not Harris can improve on those numbers will go a long way in determining the winner of this election.
That's right. It will go a long way. I think it's going to be hard to win overall, just with 8 points alone. But few things to keep in mind. First, women are more undecided compared to men, so there is a little bit more room for growth. And then second, in some of these states, abortion will be on the ballot. I know that's not the top issue in any of these states, but it's still something that we talk about pretty frequently. And it's still something that is on the mind of some of these voters. especially when they're going to be going to the ballot box over it. So that could have a significant effect. I think to state the obvious, we also have a possible first female president. So at any rate, I think that having Harris on the top of the ticket is going to be better for earning that female vote than Biden would have been. And then looking at turnout, I can't imagine a scenario in which female turnout is down with Harris on the top of the ticket. I think that can go a long way, combined with abortion being on the ballot in some places. So overall, I expect that number to grow for Harris. Maybe not to the same degree that male voters are going to back former President Trump, but at any rate, I think that she will get a boost there. We just might not be seeing the full effects yet.
You also tested the impact of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Respondents said it made them more likely to vote for Trump. I imagine a lot of those people were already Trump supporters. Is there any indication that there's been impact on swing voters?
Yeah, it doesn't look like we see much of an effect here. So we saw a bump immediately following the news cycle on behalf of President Trump, but the news cycle moved quickly. And majorities in these states say that it doesn't necessarily have an effect on their vote. Same is true of undecided voters in these states. Majorities say that it doesn't have an effect. We can see some evidence of a boost among independent voters. So across these states, Trump does win with about 45%, but a disproportionate number of those same voters are undecided, about 15%. So, I think that at the end of the day, this makes for better campaign imagery on behalf of the Trump campaign. But I don't think that this necessarily changed minds directly on who folks will choose on Election Day.
All right, super interesting polling. Matt Taglia, thanks so much for coming on. New York is telling the Supreme Court to not intervene in Trump's hush money case. The Empire State is urging the High Court to toss Missouri's long shot bid to block Trump's sentence, telling justices they have no jurisdiction. Trump was convicted in May by a New York jury on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Soon after, Republican Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey turned to the High Court, asserting the prosecution violated the rights of Missouri voters. The lawsuit seeks to block Trump's sentence and gag order until after the presidential election. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has signed a law banning gay and trans panic defenses. Under the new law, the defenses are no longer viable in Michigan courtrooms, significantly expanding legal protections for LGBTQ people against discrimination, prejudice, and hate crimes. Panic defenses allow individuals accused of violent crimes to receive lesser sentences by arguing that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity caused them to panic. These types of defenses are not freestanding and are typically used in combination with other legal strategies. Michigan becomes the 20th state to outlaw these defenses. A federal judge is warning Hunter Biden's attorneys that they could face sanctions for false statements made in their motion to dismiss his criminal charges. U.S. District Judge Mark Scarsi issued the order Wednesday, writing Biden's attorneys falsely claimed that U.S. Attorney David Weiss did not bring charges against the president's son until after he was appointed special counsel. Biden's lawyers filed the motion last week to dismiss his criminal charges in California. He's scheduled to stand trial in the fall in his tax case. The motion was also filed in Delaware to throw out Biden's criminal charges in his federal gun case that he was convicted in last month. Scarsi says Biden's team has 7 days to respond to the order. The U.S. economy is surpassing expectations, growing at a 2.8% rate in the second quarter. That, according to the Commerce Department's new data released Thursday. Economists had previously estimated gross domestic product to grow by 1.9% between April and June. The promising report comes as the Federal Reserve is set to meet next week to discuss changes to interest rates, which come in at a 2-decade high. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.